Welcome to today's Deep Dive. We're going to be exploring this really interesting dynamic between individualism and collectivism. And we've got some fascinating sources we're going to be pulling from philosophical arguments, historical examples, and we'll even be looking at some insights from figures like Socrates and Martin Luther King Jr. But the big question that we're going to try to answer through this deep dive is, how do we balance these two things, individual rights with the needs of the group?
Right.
Seems like it's a tension that's been going on for centuries.
Absolutely. This is not just some abstract philosophical debate. It has truly shaped the course of history, and it's still so relevant to how we live today.
For sure. Individual liberty is like a gift, but also a test in a way.
Right. It's not just about what you're entitled to, but it's also about recognizing that you're part of a larger community.
So it's like, yeah, you have freedom to make your own choices, but those choices should be made with an awareness of how they might affect others.
Exactly. And that really challenges this idea of radical individualism. That every person is an island unto themselves. This perspective is saying, no, we're all interconnected and our actions have consequences.
So it's more about finding a way to exercise your individual rights in a way that contributes to a harmonious society. We should do as we would be done by.
I like that.
Right.
It's simple and straightforward.
It seems so simple.
Yeah.
But then you start thinking about it and you're like, oh, wow.
Exactly.
This is way more complicated than I thought. So let's start with individualism. What are the fundamental principles?
Well, at its core, individualism really emphasizes individual rights and autonomy. It champions self-reliance and really views the individual not as just a part of a collective, but as a unique person with inherent worth.
Yeah, so recognizing the intrinsic value of each person.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, he argued that humans are ends in themselves.
Oh, interesting.
Not simply means to some collective end.
Right.
And this idea is really central to individualism.
Okay, and so how does that connect to the idea of individual rights being so important in this whole framework?
Yeah, well, Kant also had this concept called the categorical imperative. Have you heard of that?
I have. I'm not sure I remember exactly what it is, though.
Okay, so basically he said we should act according to principles that we could universalize.
Okay.
So if everybody acted on some principle, would it still be morally sound?
Oh, okay, yeah.
Individualism really asks that question.
Yeah, so it's more than just saying, oh, I'm free to do what I want.
Exactly.
It's like acting responsibly within a framework that respects everybody else's autonomy.
Right, exactly. And that emphasis on individual freedom has been linked to societal progress as well.
That's interesting.
Like John Stuart Mill, he was all about individual liberty. He argued that freedom of thought and expression, these are the cornerstones of truth.
Yeah.
And also for society to advance.
It makes sense that if you allow a variety of opinions and encourage people to think critically, you're going to come up with new solutions, new ways of looking at things.
Exactly.
Did Mill talk about how individuals should pursue, their own good within this whole freedom thing?
Oh, he did. He was very clear about that.
Right.
He really championed the right of individuals to pursue their own good in their own way. Because he believed that was essential both for personal fulfillment and also for the advancement of society as a whole.
Interesting.
So he saw this individual pursuit as a driving force for innovation.
Yeah. Okay, so now we've been focusing on individualism.
Right.
But we should also address collectivism.
Of course, yeah.
On the surface, prioritizing the needs of the group, that sounds great.
It does have a very strong appeal, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But, history has some cautionary tales for us about the potential pitfalls.
If you have unchecked collectivism, things can go wrong.
I'm curious about that. What are some examples where things went off the rails when there was too much emphasis on the collective good?
Well, let's think about the Roman Empire.
Okay.
As power became more and more centralized and individual autonomy was suppressed, that actually created conditions for instability.
Oh, wow.
Which ultimately led to its collapse, the stifling of creativity,
Oh, yeah.
If you suppress that, that can really hurt a society's vitality.
Yeah, so you get stagnation.
Exactly.
Things stop being dynamic.
Right. And we can see this in the downfall of the Soviet Union.
Oh, interesting.
Where the emphasis on the collective at the expense of individual freedom ultimately resulted in economic stagnation and also the suppression of people who dissented.
Yeah. So it seems like there needs to be a balance then.
Absolutely.
Like you need some collective action, you need responsibility to the group, but neglecting individual rights can really have consequences.
It's precisely in those situations where there's pressure to conform or stay silent that our commitment to individual liberty needs to be strongest.
Yeah, that really resonated with me because it's easy to talk about individual rights in the abstract, but it's when they're challenged, when they feel inconvenient or even risky, that their true value becomes clear.
So it's like a muscle we have to exercise.
I like that analogy.
You know, that commitment to freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of choice. If we don't use it, we might lose it.
And that's where the real work begins.
Now, you know, there have been so many people throughout history who have championed individual autonomy.
It's quite a list.
Yeah, who comes to mind when you think about that?
Well, you mentioned Socrates.
Yeah.
He challenged the entire Athenian establishment just by constantly asking questions.
Oh, yeah.
And he showed the power of individual thought and conscience. And of course, Gandhi, with his nonviolent resistance, he championed individual moral responsibility in the fight for India's independence.
Yeah.
And of course, Martin Luther King Jr., his struggle for civil rights in America that embodies the pursuit of individual dignity and equality.
It's striking how those figures all represent the struggle for individual freedom.
They do.
Against oppressive systems. And it's had such a lasting impact on our world.
Absolutely. Their courage and commitment to individual liberty, that's a constant reminder of that basic human desire for self-determination, for autonomy.
Yeah. It really resonates across cultures and history, doesn't it?
It really does.
We can't overlook the impact of Jesus Christ.
Right.
His teachings, while often interpreted, you know, through that collective lens, they also place a strong emphasis on individual conscience and moral responsibility.
That's right.
Yeah.
His emphasis on personal salvation.
Yeah.
Following one's conscience, even when it meant going against religious and political authorities. That speaks volumes. It shows that inherent tension between what we believe personally and what's imposed on us from the outside.
It really does. So that brings us to, I guess, what you would call ethical individualism.
Okay.
As like the foundation for a sustainable and healthy society.
Yeah.
What are some of the main arguments?
Well, they highlight 6 key arguments: personal responsibility, innovation, moral autonomy, the flourishing of diversity, protection against tyranny, and the advantages of free enterprise.
Whoa, that's quite a list.
Yeah, each one really deserves its own exploration.
Yeah. Do any of those, like, particularly stand out to you?
Well, I think the argument about personal responsibility is really compelling. When individuals are empowered to take ownership of their lives and decisions, they become more accountable for their actions. And I think that leads them to contribute more meaningfully to the good of everyone.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, so it's not just about helping people in the moment. It's about giving them the tools to succeed on their own.
Right, and that creates a ripple effect. You empower one person, and it impacts the whole community.
Yeah. I want to talk about the Age of Enlightenment.
Okay.
It feels like a turning point
It was.
in this whole conversation about individual rights and freedom of thought.
It was a big shift in how people thought about the individual's role in society.
Can you give us a quick overview of the key principles of the Enlightenment and why it's so important?
Sure. The Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason, it was a radical shift. It championed reason, individual rights, secularism, and democratic governance.
Wow.
It was a real departure from those traditional hierarchies and a celebration of what humans could achieve.
Oh, wow.
It emphasized critical thinking, scientific inquiry, and the pursuit of knowledge as a way to free people from ignorance and superstition.
It sounds like the Enlightenment was a breeding ground.
It was.
For new ideas and expression. And that's when you get figures like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau, these thinkers whose ideas are still relevant today.
They dared to challenge the status quo.
Yeah.
They advocated for things like free speech, separation of powers, and the social contract.
These are ideas that really shaped modern democracies.
Yes.
And still influence how we think about the relationship between the individual and the state.
Absolutely. It's remarkable, isn't it?
It is. It is.
How these ideas, from centuries ago still have such a profound impact today.
Yeah, it speaks to their power. This whole struggle to find the right balance between individual liberty and what the group needs.
Right. That tension continues today.
It does, yeah.
And as we go deeper into this, we'll see how these Enlightenment ideas continue to shape our world and how they inform our quest for a just and equitable society.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, it's amazing how these Enlightenment ideals still kind of resonate today, you know?
Yeah.
They really shape how we understand individual right and the role of government.
Yeah.
It was like this clear shift toward thinking of the individual as like the basic unit of society.
It seems like the Enlightenment really cemented that idea, of individual liberty as a foundation of a just and prosperous society.
Right.
But how do those ideas translate to our world now? We've got new challenges.
We do.
It's a totally different social landscape.
It is, how do we make sure individual rights aren't sacrificed when we're trying to do things for the collective good?
Yeah.
It's this tension we're always grappling with.
It feels like finding that balance is more important than ever.
I think so. And that need for critical thinking,
yeah,
it applies to politics too.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Governments and corporations are getting more and more powerful.
Right.
And that makes you worry about individual liberties.
It's like a reminder, you know, that those Enlightenment ideals, the focus on individual rights,
right,
limited government, those aren't just like achievements that are done and over.
No.
We have to actively work to make sure they're upheld.
Yeah, we have to be mindful of history.
Right.
Draw inspiration from those who fought so hard for individual liberty.
Yeah.
You know, Socrates, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
Their legacies show us that the fight for individual freedom is never really over.
That's a good point.
It takes courage.
And a willingness to stand up to the status quo.
So with all these challenges to individual autonomy, can feel overwhelming sometimes.
They can.
Like, what can we as individuals do to make sure our rights are protected and still contribute to the common good?
Being aware of what's happening around us, the ways our liberties can be chipped away, and the dangers of unchecked collectivism. Just temporarily suspending people's rights can just totally destroy the trust that any society needs to function.
Right.
Especially in a crisis.
Exactly.
It's like if the government can just take away your rights when things get tough, why would you ever trust them to give them back later?
And a perfect example of that is, the Patriot Act in the U.S. after 9/11.
Oh, yeah.
It expanded the government's surveillance powers,
right,
all in the name of security.
Right.
But it also eroded privacy. It really chilled free speech. And we're still debating, the long-term consequences of those decisions.
Individualism is sacred. The collective group is not a real identity and grows from the individual.
Wow.
Yeah. Kind of makes you think, right? Like, is a group really just like a bunch of individuals mashed together? I'd love to unpack this with you.
Okay.
So let's dive in.
Okay.
What makes the individual so sacred in your view?
Well, I think what's really fascinating about this statement is this implication that the group, no matter how unified or collective it may seem, should never be considered a replacement for the individual.
Yeah.
And there's this sense that if you lose individual liberty, you kind of lose humanity itself almost.
Whoa. What about like our responsibility to the community?
Well, and I don't think this is dismissing the community entirely. I think what the statement seems to be highlighting is a hierarchy of importance.
Okay.
Right? And I think what it's saying is that the individual is the foundation.
Okay.
Think of it like a building. Right? You need strong individual bricks to create a stable structure.
Right.
Without those individual components, the building crumbles.
Right. No, that analogy really brings it to life.
Yeah.
So are you saying then that groups don't have any inherent value?
Well, no. And again, I think it's more nuanced than that. It's saying that groups derive their meaning and purpose from the individuals within them.
Okay.
So a sports team, a company, a nation, they're all comprised of individuals working towards a shared goal.
Right.
But if we lose sight of the individual, of their inherent worth, then the group becomes something dangerous, potentially.
It reminds me of that quote.
Yeah.
The smallest minority on earth is the individual.
Right.
Those who deny individual rights cannot claim to be defenders of minorities.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah, it's powerful stuff. It really makes you think about how you see yourself
Yeah.
within the groups that you belong to. thank you for going on this journey with us.
Yeah, thanks for listening.